Hey everybody, it's Razib Khan with Josiah Neely, and we are here for conversation number 44. And Josiah, what is going on in the world? Well, I mean, I guess we said the world for a very specific reason because we're going to start with non-domestic stuff. So why don't you tell us what's going on?
Yeah, well, so I was thinking a few weeks ago, I was thinking that things were finally kind of settling down, and maybe in the summer, sometimes you have the summer doldrums where there's not a lot of news or whatnot. But that's changed. That's changed, and now we're back to a situation where every few days the media focus just totally changes, right? So, as we're recording this, the current big thing is war, Israel, Iran, U.S. not involved so far, but they've been just kind of pounding each other back and forth. Israel attacking Iranian nuclear facilities and command centers, that sort of stuff, and Iran sending its own hypersonic missiles, various places, Tel Aviv, other places like that. So it's a you know it's a kind of it's a curious kind of conflict in that it's something that is uh, I, I don't know exactly how to describe it because we're invested, but we're not involved. Perhaps that's the way to put it. The U.S. is not participating in these attacks, at least not so far. And Iran seems to recognize that they are not striking back at U.S. personnel anywhere, at least so far. That could change by the time this comes out, But right. But at the same time, it's also we're not doing anything to stop it. We basically said, hey, Israel can do what it wants, right? It has to pursue its interests as it sees it, and we're not for nuclear Iran. And in to some degree, the U.S. is also has been trying to negotiate with Iran about its nuclear program. So this does kind of tie into that. But yeah, so that's the situation. I just finished, coincidentally enough, a reread of the uh, Book of Revelation, the Apocalypse according to Saint John. So there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of you can always find stuff in there about current events, but certainly when you got like bombing in Middle Eastern cities, it comes out.
Yeah. I guess what I have to say about this, just in a general sense, after the, early 2000s, the 2003 Iraq War, I'm actually like very, very reluctant to make I want to say strident or definitive claims about foreign policy things because it turns out most people that are very confident don't know what they're talking about. It was just very clear in hindsight, and this has happened over and over again. On the other hand, when big things are happening and there's lives at stake and geopolitical, with geopolitical ramifications, people want you to have a strong opinion. How could you not have a strong opinion? So it's a difficult situation, and I just have to explain to people, look, I've seen people like be full of crap before. I'm not going to concede that you actually know what you're talking about, even if you're an expert, because the experts are just full of crap.
Right.
Uh, that's just fundamentally the truth of what I think people of our generation, older millennials, uh, and older, people that are, let's say, approximately 40 and older, remember it very clearly because we were told many things by experts, and it turned out the communists were correct. you know, which was super embarrassing. Now, the communists were not correct because they knew anything. They were just correct because their premises or their priors just happened to align more with reality. The communists and Dr. Greg Cochran, basically, you
Yeah.
know, did work in physics at in Los Alamos and that sort of area. So
Yeah.
there were very very few people who actually knew what was going on. And in hindsight, certain things seem obvious. For example, Iraq is not Iran, and it probably did not really have a capacity really to have weapons of mass destruction in comparison to the
Iraq.
economic, its economic state during that period. Okay, that makes sense now, but at the time,
Right.
you had all these people telling you about all these things that were happening and all this evidence, No, it was all lies. And so I'm just very, very wary. And I have a more of a, I mean, I'll use the word isolationist. It's not a popular word now, but I have a more of a, kind of a modest, humble foreign policy approach, as George W. Bush had said before 9/11, or kind of what Trump tries to do. I think that that's actually a good premise to go out there with because it gets you not involved in things that you cannot uninvolve yourself with, and it just kind of accepts that you don't know what's going on out there. And as America, we already have a lot of influence just naturally, and so when we get involved, it's kind of like we are Planet X, and our gravitational pull distorts everything. So that's my premise. On the other hand, I'm not a hardcore non-interventionist like some anarcho-capitalists can be, uh, because American hegemony, for example, keeps the world's sea lanes pretty clear for free trade, which I guess we're against now. So there are some confusions here. There's some confusions here. Like American power does have a stabilizing influence. The ideal is actually, I think, Teddy Roosevelt, kind of, I think, philosophy where, you speak softly, carry a big stick, but basically the threat of American omnipower is
Right.
enough. So you don't have to do anything. We spend a lot on military. We have like great weapons, and we have all these bases. And, some people are like, "Well, we should use our weapons." I'm like, "Actually, no. Like, one, you use up the weapons, and you gotta
Right.
build more weapons, and people die, and that's bad." And, even with, like, the painless wars of the Gulf War and Gulf War II in terms of, I mean, not Gulf War II, like, the second Iraq War wasn't painless. There was tens of thousands of Americans who died. But even the first one where hundreds of Americans died, tens of thousands of Iraqis died, and southern Iraq was, like, destroyed. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't have done it. I think arguably Gulf War One in particular was probably kind of justified, although restoring Kuwaiti democracy was stupid in hindsight. It was an oil war, but my point here is that war is serious, and there's all these long term consequences beyond the initial feels of like euphoric victory. It's not like ideally, a war is kind of like the Franco-Prussian War or something, where there's like a quick war, someone loses, and there's really not that much damage to the underlying infrastructure.
Yeah.
But that's not how it is a lot of the time. And then there's like insurgencies, and you know, Iraq is basically an Iranian proxy now in many ways. Not totally, but to some extent, it's a Shia state. It's aligned with Iran. Its leadership often is Iranian sourced. And so it definitely didn't work out the way we thought. We actually created a proxy for Iran by overthrowing Saddam. So this just took a long way to say that right now it looks good, I think, from the American perspective, because we don't really want Iran with nuclear weapons. The Iranian regime is, I also want to emphasize, it's pretty stupid the way it is because, it has this third position where it's neither East nor West. It doesn't align with communism or the West.
Yeah.
Communism doesn't exist anymore. So the Iranian regime's geopolitical stance arose in the 1980s at a time when it was trying to create kind of a, Islamic non-aligned bloc.
Yeah.
And so it tries to be this revolutionary regime and try to export its revolution, which it did more aggressively than not in the early years, but still periodically that shows up, and that's one of the reasons it can't have rapprochement with a lot of other states, because it still has this official revolutionary regime or revolutionary ideology, which nobody in Iran, not nobody, but like a lot of people in Iran know, like probably the majority of the people don't have faith in it. The vast majority of people were born after the revolution. And so I think we are kind of in a stage of the Brezhnev era for Iran, which can last a long time, depending on how much of
Right.
the oil money will go. It can last decades. But the point here is nobody really believes that they're going to bring an Islamic revolution all over the Islamic world. That period, that phase is actually probably 25 years out of date. And unfortunately for Iran, it's a Shia nation. Therefore, it never ended up being able to lead that revolution after the Ayatollah Khomeini died. Like Khomeini himself, with his stature and with his charisma, was able to marshal some Sunnis. But the reality is, after he died, Iran was always going to be like, a source of money, maybe kind of like a supporting player, like with Hamas. But it was not going to be the leader of the Islamic world because it can't be because of a sectarian divide. And so we have all of these complicated issues that we're getting involved in. Right now, it feels good, but if the regime does collapse, Uh, I don't think another theocratic regime will come up, but like it could be total chaos. I don't know. And I'm worried about that.
Yeah. So let me just start by agreeing with something that you said, which is I don't really know what I'm talking about on all these foreign policy stuffs. I can't. There was a Philip Tetlock. He had a book, Expert Political Judgment, that came out. I don't know, a while ago now. That kind of demonstrates. So it's about how accurate are experts in different fields in terms of making predictions or whatever. And when it comes to foreign policy, I think the bottom line conclusion is that if you are a reasonably informed person who like reads the New York Times or the Economist or whatever, this book was written back when people, magazines and newspapers still existed. But if if you keep up with current events to that extent, your predictive track record is about as good as the experts, right? So I will take that as license to give my opinion, even though I don't really know what I'm talking about. And frankly, my track record of predicting world events has not been very great. But it's the point of the show is we just get to talk and give our opinions or something. So first, let me say it's kind of weird that this whole Israel strikes Iran's nuclear sites thing is happening now because it's been a conversation for basically my whole adult life. 20 years ago, I can remember people saying Iran is a couple years away from having a nuclear weapon, blah, 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 blah. And of course, they kept saying that at some point. Maybe they're months away, they're days away. And of course, for various reasons, up until now, military strikes had never happened. There were some, occasionally Iranian nuclear scientists, you know, would have a car accident or there would be some malware installed on some stuff, right? So it's not like there was nothing going on, but in terms of the big military option, it never happened for whatever reason. But also the Iranian bomb just didn't happen, you know? And I'm not entirely sure why that is, whether it's actually kind of difficult to make a nuclear weapon. And so just because Iran has a bunch of rich uranium, they weren't able to actually put it together, or if the mullahs wanted the ability to potentially to make a nuclear weapon to say that they might, but they didn't actually want to do that. That would be a little too risky. I actually don't think that necessarily makes sense. I think that historically, if you just compare, for example, Libya to North Korea got a nuke. They made nuclear weapons. Libya gave up its weapons program, and we know what happened to the leaders of those countries. So I think from like a realpolitik point of view, if you could make a nuclear weapon, you'd think that you would want to just do it, if especially if you're some sort of rogue state that everybody wants to take out, because once you join the nuclear club, you know, people are a lot more restricted in terms of what they feel like they can do to you. So I don't know. Maybe that means that Iran just for what somehow just was not able to pull it off, build a nuke. But for whatever reason, they just never did it. And I read Netanyahu's autobiography a few years ago, and it was clear from that autobiography that he had kind of two political goals in life. Like his entire political career, there were two things that he wanted to do. One was liberalize the Israeli economy, which he succeeded in doing when he was, I think, the economics minister back in the '90s, something like that. Move Israel, orient Israel away from its socialist origins. And then the other is bomb Iran. He's been talking about doing this for 20 years. So it's surprising, and he's been prime minister for most of that time. So it's surprising that it didn't happen until now. I guess the stars just kind of aligned. My only other thought is war between Iran and Israel is kind of weird in the sense that normally when you have wars between countries, they're either countries that are right next to each other, they border each other, like with Russia or Ukraine or Armenia, Azerbaijan, or you one of the countries is kind of a regional or global power such that they can project force. You know, like the US, we can invade Iraq even though it's halfway across the world. Now we had staging areas in Saudi Arabia, whatnot, but you know, we can do stuff like that, right? Neither Israel nor Iran have they don't border each other. There's a bunch of countries in between them, and neither of them really has the capacity to physically invade or conquer the other one, right? Like Israel can't really get over there and put boots on the ground, and neither could the Iranians. So what do? I mean, they can launch missiles at each other. They used to be able to attack each other with proxies, but Israel's kind of mm, decimated Iran's proxies in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Syria. You know, I think that's part of the reason why the strikes happen now is because Israel had effectively crippled Iran's ability to strike back through, you know, some bordering country. um, so when you don't have, obviously, when neither country has the ability to conquer the other one, it's a question of like, you know, how exactly does this resolve? They shoot missiles at each other for a while until they get kind of bored or tired of it. I don't know. I don't think they're going to have peace necessarily. You could, in theory, have the fall of one of or the other of the governments, right? Um, which would play out very differently. I agree, given the difference in the regime. So that's possible, but absent that, I don't know. Do they just kind of go back and forth until they run out of weapons?
Yeah, I mean, the issue at this point, from what I can tell, is how does Iran exit out of this with saving face,
Right.
so that the regime doesn't. I mean, Khamenei, he's been in power since 1989.
Yeah.
He is 86 years old, I believe. Uh, so he needs to groom an
Older
heir.
than Biden.
Yeah, and he's had health issues. He's had health issues, and they obviously could take him out.
Who is the Kamala Harris of Iran? You know,
I
who
don't know. I don't think that there is one right now, because there have been some people who've tried to be heirs, and then it turned out that they were. I mean, Khomeini himself was he was like a backup, because like Ali Montessori, who died, I think he
right.
became a liberal, and so Khomeini, not Khomeini,
Yes.
um, replaced him with the current one, and Ali Khamenei himself is not actually like a big. So Iran is one thing about. Okay, I need to like put something in here, just like in terms of how people lie, or just like how they're stupid. I am like a little triggered and just like annoyed when some of the, I don't know if I want to call them Zionists, but Israel hawks are like, the mad mullahs are mad and they have like an Islamo-fascist ideology. I'm like, just shut up. Like, we did this 25 years ago, just
Right.
come on. And like, the reality is, like, I'm not going to have any of that. I tend to be pro-Israel more than not, but like, you know, there's like a hysterical aspect to this sort of thing, which is like, okay, well then you can take care of all this. You don't need our nuclear shield, and you don't need our backing then, It's just like,
Right.
I do think, like, to defend, I'm not gonna totally defend Tucker Carlson, whatever, but like, to defend that impulse on the MAGA right now, which is still there, but I don't really think it's. I think like Trump can turn it. I think they will do whatever Trump says, honestly, except for like some of the real isolationists. Like, Tucker might be one of those, but that's because Tucker was burned by the second Iraq War, just like we were. He remembers being lied to. So, um, but I mean, what I'm getting at there is, like, the Iranian regime itself is weird, and it's actually like very novel, and it has nothing to do really with traditional Shia Islam. Like, rule by jurist is something Ayatollah Khomeini made up in the 1970s.
Hmm.
Like, that's not how a Muslim regime is supposed has ever been ruled anywhere. Okay, so this theocracy was invented in the 1970s and imposed on Iran. There's no structural reason why it should like be in existence.
Yeah. A lot of the government around sounds like the government of some 1970s science fiction movie. Just the name of like, you know, Supreme Governing Council and like don't I think they do they have a council of experts? I think they have a council of experts.
Yeah, yeah, they do, and so it's supposed to be it's not okay, it's a little overdone. It's
Yeah.
a little,
The Guardians, I think they have like the Guardians. Don't they have the Guardians?
yeah, yeah, so what I was saying is, like, um, this it's a little overdone, but there is some suggestion that it was somewhat influenced by Plato's The Republic, which,
Right.
like, so one difference between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam, again, this is also somewhat overdone, but Shia Islam has a lot more of the early Islamic philosophical orientation, uh,
Mm.
preserved within it. And so Shia jurists tend to study, like they study the Mutazilites who were like, exiled from Sunni Islam. So Sunni Islam is traditionally much more focused on the hadith and the law. Like in Judaism, you call it halakha, so Sharia. Whereas Shia Islam has Sharia, but it also has a lot of philosophical stuff to various degrees, depending on what type of Shia Islam it is. And so the mainstream, the dominant 12er Shia, which is the biggest group, which is in Iran and in Iraq and in Lebanon, for example, they have a fair amount of like philosophical education in for their clerics, and so they do read Plato. They do read some Aristotle, like in translation, obviously, and so the Ayatollah Khomeini was familiar with Plato, and my understanding is people overdo how important Plato's Republic was in creating the Islamic Republic, but probably the truth is probably in the middle of people who argue, oh, it had no influence, and the people that are like, it was totally based on Plato's Republic. I
Right.
mean, you read Plato's Republic, and you see that the Islamic Republic has these like trained theocrats, like these trained clerics,
Yeah.
to guard like the republic from like to guard like basically the civilian administration and the military administration from doing bad things, because ultimately morals and ethics are above everything. Like it is ruled by God's law, right? So that's how it is a theocracy. But this is all made up in the 1970s, and like Vali Nasser is he's a pretty prominent scholar in this area. There's a whole literature about the development of this like Shia radicalism, and some of it was very left coded. They called it red Shiaism, and that was pushed aside earlier in the revolution when they decided like we're going to stay pretty much capitalist, and so like the bazaar took over, and so there's all these details. My only point in getting into this is like when people are like, oh, like they want like the Mahdi come and they want to like destroy the whole world and all this stuff, and yeah, that's in some of their rhetoric, but like look at the way they behave.
Right.
I mean they could have done that a long time ago.
Yeah. I would say you said that I mean the Ayatollah, he's what, 86, 88 or something.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, if you're committed, like he's pretty old,
Let's
to
go.
still
Let's
be
go.
around, right? You know
Yeah,
what I'm
yeah.
saying? So yeah, I've long had a kind of suspicion that I'm not saying they don't believe it or whatever, but some of the apocalypticism, apocalyptic rhetoric and other stuff like that seems like it's more for show. In fact, I mean, often there are numerous cases in the past where someone will attack Iran in one way or the other, and Iran will either do nothing in response or will make the like most minimal response.
Yeah, so Trump said that, during after the whole Soleimani thing or something,
Right. Right.
they like called him up and they're like, "Hey, we're gonna send some missiles, but like they're not gonna really hit anything major. So can you just be chill?"
Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 So yeah, that's an example. There's also, I mean, there's a case in the late 1980s where the Iranians. I think they had been messing with some of our oil tankers or whatever. So we just destroyed, like the U.S. just destroyed their navy in a day. It was called Operation Praying Mantis, and and the Iranians just didn't do anything. They're like, okay, whatever, moving on. Uh, which is not to say that they're good guys or turn the other cheek people or whatever, but they're they're pragmatic. I think they understand um, that in certain fights they're going to lose, and so the key is
Yeah.
to lose in a way that, as you say, like maintains face or whatever.
Well, so here's another thing that also is to consider. Like the regime itself is obviously a corporate entity. And
Right.
so, famously, the Revolutionary Guards operate as basically, I mean, we could call them paramilitary, but they're actually like
Yeah.
more effective than the military itself. Iran has a secular military, and the secular military, that was the military that stepped aside during the revolution, kind of let the Shah get overthrown because they lost confidence in the Shah. They
Right.
could do the same thing here. They just step aside.
Right.
Revolutionary Guards been decapitated. Salami was killed. So, I mean, that's not, I mean, he knows that salami is made out of pork too, so it's like
I
I don't
know.
know.
Right. 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 Well,
Like,
he knew that. I don't know if he. Yeah.
but like all these generals have been killed. Like the regime's been like, except for like it seems like they're decapitating everybody except for Khomeini, and
Right.
like that might be so that Khomeini has enough authority to just make peace. Like sue for peace. I don't know. That's what I would assume. So right now, as we're recording, like Iran is to a great extent defanged. And so now the question is, do you want to go in and do like full regime change? I don't know how serious the Israeli war hawks are about regime change because I think they saw what happened with Iraq. I think they might just want a pacified revolutionary regime because the reality is,
Yeah.
you know, another thing I have to say is I didn't know this because there's only so much stuff you can keep track of. In 2005, Iran's economy was way bigger than Saudi Arabia, and now it's way smaller.
Right.
Like, it's really, really dragged behind
Yeah.
the region because of sanctions and this, like, Iran is a little bit like Pakistan, where it's a nation that has a lot of people and has some heft and can be a geopolitical player if it wants to devote all of its effort to that. But
Right.
there's an opportunity cost, a massive opportunity cost. Whereas, compared to Pakistan, India is so big that it doesn't need to devote that much of its GDP to the military
Yeah.
to maintain parity with Pakistan. So Pakistan can like, it's kind of like those Edwardian gentlemen that would go into debt to maintain a lifestyle as nobles and their status. Well, that's what Iran kind of did, and now the debts are kind of getting to be called because the people themselves are sick of being, on the margins, of being poor, kind of like the Soviet Union during the Brezhnev era. In the Brezhnev era, a lot, you've read a lot of actually about the Soviet Union, I know. So,
Yeah.
but most people say that communism was probably extended by the OPEC oil cartels, 1970s,
Hmm.
uh, regime that propped up prices, so it allowed the Soviet Union, which was getting cash out of its oil exports,
Right.
to extend probably for an extra decade. And then what happened in the early 1980s when oil prices collapsed is that all of a sudden the Soviet Union had a huge problem with just like financing its command economy, and this guy Gorbachev decided not to bring the hammer down. If he'd bring the hammer down, probably they could have lived on for a while. Just like Cuba has. You
Yes.
know,
Right.
but he wasn't going to do that, and so eventually there was it switched over, right? So I think Iran is kind of in that stage. They could bring the hammer down. The regimes can last a long time. Like especially ever since the what is the Green Revolution in 2009. They've been like waiting for Iran to like get overthrown within the next like 6 weeks, and it's
Right.
over 15 years. So, I'm not saying that it's going to get overthrown, but I think we are entering a new phase where the mask has kind of fallen off, and Israel has shown that they can really degrade Iran really fast. Also, the last thing is the extent of, I think, the faith in the regime or the lack of faith in the regime is illustrated by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president from, about a decade ago,
Yeah.
uh, a decade or more ago, when he said that the anti-Mossad unit uh, in Iranian intelligence turned out to be all Mossad moles, which is kind of like a
Right.
satire, a comedy sketch, but
Yes.
he claims that this is what happened.
Yeah.
So the Iranian regime is clearly riddled with informers. So
Right.
that means that there's a lack of faith in the regime. Like
What?
people just don't believe.
Yeah. It seems like a large percentage of the Israeli attacks on Iran have originated from within Iran, like drone strikes and other stuff like that. So yes, I'm sure that there is a lot of that. It is, uh, the Mossad has shown itself to be able to combine, sophistication and like badassery with like a sense of humor, like with the pager thing and whatever. So if the anti-Mossad unit was all Mossad agents, I guess that would fit into that. Uh,
Well, and one thing is, one of the reasons the Jewish communities in not to justify anything, but one of the reasons the Jewish communities in the Middle East have been targeted is because of the suspicion that they are, fifth columnists.
right.
I think at this point though, it's understood that, if they get caught, like it's gonna be bad for the Jews. And I really doubt there are too many also like the Iranian regime can track all 10,000
Yeah,
Jews
I
in Iran.
can't imagine that they're letting the actual, Iranian Jews anywhere
Yeah.
near, it's not like,
Yeah. So
okay, the
these
janitor at
are
the nuclear plant or yeah,
yeah, these are people that are quote part of the regime.
Right, yeah, well, at least formally tend to be very anti-Zionist. I mean, it's notable that I think they're basically the only, um I don't think that there's any other Middle Eastern country aside from Israel itself, of course, that still has a Jewish population of any size, you know?
Well, I mean, if you count Morocco.
Okay, well, yeah, I don't yeah, I mean, I would not say that's the Middle East, that's North Africa, but fair. Um, and maybe I don't know, I guess there are Jews in Turkey, I don't know, but,
Yes, there's a really small Jewish community in Turkey, and I think that there are now Jews in UAE.
right, yeah, but I
They're
don't
allowed now.
yeah, yeah, well, they're allowed, yeah. Um, that does raise
Egypt may still have some.
I mean, they probably have some, more than 0, but in terms of, like, community, uh, it's pretty rare, and
Okay, yeah, you're right. Egypt has 20.
yeah, right, yeah, yeah, okay,
So there's 58,000 Egyptian Jews in Israel, and there's 20
right, 20
or maybe a dozen,
in
depending on
Egypt,
time of the year
right, right,
in Egypt. I mean, the Jews that are left in places like Egypt or Iraq are like the token Jew that is like keeping the synagogue going, and they're probably only there because of that, because they feel bad about it or whatever, you
right,
know.
yeah,
So, but I mean, we should probably like wind this down in terms of like I think I think like my attitude is like I think it's pretty uncertain what's going to happen in the future. I think it's probably good for Israel. And it's probably good for America that Iran got severely degraded. This was definitely a lot. I mean, this is horrible to say, but let me just like explicitly say it. In some ways, October 7th was good for Israel
mhm, yeah,
because, first of all, it was a wake up call.
right,
First of all, because clearly the Israelis were getting lazy. It was a wake up call, and then Israel decided to like massive retaliation, knocked out Gaza operationally, or knocked out Hamas and Gaza operationally, and then it decided to escalate against Hezbollah in the north, which was sniping at it, knocked out Hezbollah, decapitated
mhm,
Hezbollah,
right,
um, and then eventually it Israel was involved in probably the overthrow of the I mean, at least more than tangentially in the Assad regime. And the Assad regime was the major state proxy
mhm,
for Iran. And that relationship actually goes back before the fall of the Shah. It goes back into the 1970s because the Assad regime was run for and by, to a great extent, the Alawite minority who
right,
were traditionally not even seen as Muslims. But in 1974, an Iranian Ayatollah um, made a ruling that they were 12 or Shia, which is like
right,
not true, but that doesn't matter. It
right,
was all for like geopolitical because that way the Assads could be defined as Muslims, so they could be heads of state and all that stuff. There was a huge issue, right? But so Syria has been aligned with Iran even before the revolutionary regime, and in fact, the fact that the Ayatollah Khomeini looked the other way when not Bashar, Hafiz al-Assad, his father, killed the Muslim Brotherhood in Hama in 1983 was
right,
kind of the end of the first phase of revolutionary Iran because after that, Sunni just didn't believe them, you know?
right,
And so we have all of these like, domino effect where Iran was all of a sudden exposed. I mean, the Houthis are still there in Yemen, but like, to be honest, they're kind of a nuisance and they're more of like a threat to world trade than to Israel.
right,
Um, and so like the Houthis are the proxy that are still there, but Iran's exposed. It's economically weak right now for various reasons, and obviously every year that goes by, it seems like the populace has less and less faith in the legitimacy of the regime. I mean, women are running around with their headscarves off all the time, and
yeah,
it's just like eventually. eventually, like, something's gotta give here. The youth are obviously just fed up with the economic climate, and, I have it's hard because, like, we see the more westernized elements all the time in our media, like, the people that come abroad, like, they're like, I'm not talking about the people that left in the 1970s and the 1980s, but, like, people, like, now, they're super westernized, like, they immediately take off their hijab and they just, like, become like, they fit in, right? So it seems like a lot of the Iranian population, because of the internet, and education, has been totally assimilated into the Western mindset, and I don't think that that's a good, recipe for long-time regime stability, but, you know, um, we can't predict when it's gonna happen, even if it will happen.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that it's basically up to the military. If the military decides to switch sides and back the protest, they will do it. And this is just my read, is that if you actually to overthrow authoritarian regime, people power by itself is not enough. You need either foreign backing or some sort of
Yeah.
institutional uh, fracture.
Yeah, this is what the empirical data show.
Yeah.
The empirical data show that, you need an institutional ally, and then it'll work. I mean, the French, revolutionary France was the same, I mean,
Right.
uh, a large part of the nobility
I
and
mean,
the
it was
high
the state.
bourgeoisie, like,
Yeah.
y
Yeah.
they had lost faith in the monarchy, you
Right.
know?
Yeah. And it's the
Um
same thing happened in with the Russian Revolution. It was first it was the Tsar's own generals who got him to abdicate, and then Um, so yeah, this is, I think, a frequent thing throughout history. One thing I will also say, right now things are looking pretty good for Israel, and maybe that will continue. The world is an unpredictable place. To some extent, I think it is to Israel's benefit to continue to have Iran as a boogeyman, because the rise of Iran has been fairly good for Israel in the region geopolitically. If we were to go back 20 years and talk about the tacit, there's going to be a tacit alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel, that would not have sounded plausible, but the threat of Iran has brought all sorts of people together and has helped encourage, even changes in Saudi Arabia. I was Someone on X posted, there's a video of, I guess it was the weather weather lady in Tehran. I don't know if you saw this video. There's this woman, she's wearing, it's not the hijab, the
Yeah, it's like a hu it's more of, like, the full thing. Are you talking about the one that where the bombing happened?
yeah, yeah, there's a bombing while
I
she
didn't
was
know what she was doing,
there.
yeah.
Yeah, so anyway, but she's wearing, like, I mean, it's like a Bene Gesserit type of outfit.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
No offense, but although that's probably where, obviously, that's where Frank Herbert got it. But uh, and then someone did a side by side of that and an anchor woman in Saudi Arabia,
Oh, yeah.
who was dressed conservatively. I mean, but she wasn't really dressed any differently than like Katie Couric or anyone else who was like reading the news. Her head was uncovered or whatever. And so that's not the image that we have of Saudi Arabia would have had 20 years ago, certainly. So
No, Saudi Arabia's totally transformed in the last 5 years.
yeah, uh,
Well,
yeah,
that's another thing, like, but 10, 15 years ago, there was an awkward reality that Iran was much more liberal socially than Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was our ally. So women in Saudi Arabia couldn't drive. They were like covered up, like their faces were totally covered, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, there's no democracy; they can't vote. Whereas in Iran, women like are in higher education. They can be vice president. I think. Like, they can't be president. I mean, they don't have like full equal rights, but they are
right,
actually not that bad off on paper compared to Saudi Arabia, or were compared to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And then what happened is MBS just was like, okay, we're just gonna let it rip.
right,
Westernization, we're gonna let it rip. And it turned out, one of the things about Saudi Arabia, and I've mentioned this before, is like it turned out there was a preference falsification problem, or a preference cascade. It turned out that a lot of the men in Saudi Arabia, that were younger, they thought all the other men would judge them if they let their wives drive and be,
right,
more liberated. And actually, the reality is, like, they were all okay with it. And so, like, all of a sudden, everyone was like looking around. They're like, oh,
right.
okay.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know? So it was like they all kinda like everyone just stepped forward at the exact same time kinda thing, and that's why it, like, switched so fast. I think Iran is almost certainly the same, in
Oh,
terms
yeah,
of,
yeah.
like,
Sure.
there's a lot
Probably
of,
even
like
more so, to be honest.
yeah, because that's been going because Iran is, like is frankly a more well, I would say cultured, advanced society than Saudi Arabia. It has been for decades, you know? I
Century,
mean, I
millennia.
mean, we see yeah, and, like, in terms of it's because there's no, like, huge Saudi diaspora, there's a huge Iranian diaspora that's, like, quite westernized,
Yeah.
quite well integrated to both the United States and in France. Those are the 2 countries where I would say they're pretty well integrated into the I mean, even in, like, Sweden, for example, where it's had problems with Muslim immigrants, the Iranians actually do fine because the ones that left, are the ones that, like, are much more pro-liberal,
Right.
kind of, or, like, pro-Western. I mean, that's the irony of, Iranian compared to say Turkish, compared to say Turks, like as in like ethnic Turks from Turkey, in
Mhm.
place like Germany, the Iranians are much more liberal and prone to assimilating, whereas the Turks tend to be more conservative in a lot of ways than Turks in Turkey. You know,
Right.
and so we have this like interesting situation. So obviously, it's really complicated. There's a lot of things going on. This is one reason that I don't like take maximalist position either way, and it's let's keep monitoring it. It looks like there's not going to be World War III. It looks like the Iranian regime is figuring out how to exit out of an untenable situation where it's kind of like got a lot of bad choices, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
It'll figure it out.
Yeah. Well,
So speaking of, I don't want to say bad choices, but like untenable situation, we're having kind of riots in the United States due to the immigration enforcement of ICE. I will say, uh, I think immigration enforcement is important. Uh, but I do think that, I mean, some of the performative stuff that the Trump administration is doing is probably important to send a signal. But I think it's a fine line, and I do think that if they ramp it up at scale, I think it will alienate a lot of basically, everybody but the Stephen Miller fan club.
mm,
Because I think the, the the reality is most Americans want immigration enforcement at the border. That's why Trump still has positive polling on this and has the whole time. Because what happened in the early Biden administration in particular was unconscionable. They knew exactly what they were doing, which was nothing.
right.
And some of the Democrats are still kind of like beating at that drum of like no enforcement,
Yeah.
which nobody, uh, nobody really wants to. Nobody really wants to go back to that, except for like maybe 25% of the population, kind of like the Democratic like liberal base, and like they don't really have coherent views on it. They think enforcement is bad. They have feels about it. It's not like they don't even they're not Brian Kaplan. They don't have an articulate view of open borders.
Yes. Right. Right. Yeah.
They just have a de facto view of open borders. So we're against that. On the other hand, Trump has said straight out, he's getting complaints from businesses, which is true. And like I've been in and around restrictionists for a long time, and there was this whole idea that well Americans will do the job if you pay them enough, and for a long time, when we were young, it was teenagers that would do a lot of the jobs that now immigrants do, Mexicans quite often, but not always, just Mexicans. um, my main change from like 25 years ago is since 2008 our fertility has dropped a lot.
Yeah.
We actually don't have the same number of teenagers that we did,
Right.
um, but our demand for labor keeps increasing. Robots are not online. Peter Brimelow, who is a quote controversial figure, but people said that about me, so I don't want to cast any shade on him. But nobody would say he's a squish on immigration. He ran VDARE. He's been involved in immigration reform, restrictionism since the 1990s in the United States, writing a cover article in National Review '94. Uh, Early on in VDare's history, he said that unlike many of the people at VDare, he supports guest workers.
Mhm.
So I think the point here, and Brimelow comes out of financial journalism. I think he was being a realist here. The reality is we cannot. I mean, it's a little bit like tariffs. I really don't think we could just overnight deport everybody and then expect business to go on as usual. I think people will get to be annoyed. And my understanding from like few people online is there are certain areas where Americans will, given enough pay, do certain jobs. So there's some meat packing jobs where probably more Americans would go work. It's kind of like a factory job. It feels like that.
Right.
But Americans will not, like native born Americans, except for like the minority that were like raised in that like environment are not going to go pick your crops.
Hmm.
That's just not a thing Americans do anymore. It's not the 1930s anymore, you know? So I do think that we do need guest workers from whatever country. I think what Americans need to do is like kind of like rethink our immigration system and figure out ways where we can get economic product from people without having to say that they're going to become part of our nation, which was kind of something we did actually before the border got tough
Yeah.
under the late G.W. Bush and early Obama administration, because Mexicans would go back and forth. Because
Right.
what we need is people that are
People.
going to
Yeah.
live in Mexico but come work here periodically and then go back. We do need that. That's what I got to say. And so, but we're not having an honest conversation about that on the left or the right.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw Trump did. It wasn't a tweet because it was on Truth Social, so it was a truth. But he had a truth a few days ago about how he had been talking to our America First MAGA farmers about labor shortages from crackdowns on illegal immigration. So he was going to adjust the priorities so that farmers weren't able to get enough labor, blah, 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 blah. I think he also might have mentioned like construction or housing or something. So it does seem that, rhetoric aside, I do think that Trump is kind of calibrating in terms of wanting to secure the border, wanting to increase deportations, but also not wanting to cripple different sectors of the economy, especially those like farmers that are very supportive of Trump and the Republicans overall. So probably you'll have some sort of equilibrium that will develop there. I don't see that it will necessarily. It's manageable, I would say. The riots, thankfully, seem to have kind of petered out. They were never really. I mean, so the riots were in Los Angeles, and then I know that there were some minor riots here or disturbances here in Austin and in other places in Texas. I didn't see anything about such things happening anywhere else in the country. I'm not talking about like the No Kings protests or whatever, but the like actual vandalism, getting into it with the cops, trying to block traffic and, the vans, the deportation vans or so that thankfully it there was a moment where it seemed like we were in a 2020 redux situation. We were headed for that, perhaps. And for right now, it seems that we've avoided that. So that's good because I was frankly getting a little pissed off. I still maybe have some PTSD about 2020, and I was like, I'm not to quote the guy from Jaws 2, I'm not going through that hell again. So I was just not like when I see on Facebook people were trying to make kind of pseudo justifications for the rioting or whatever. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm just not having it. It's stupid. Don't go there, and you know, suppress it however you need to make sure it doesn't spread. Which it seems like it's happened. It also seems like, for a variety of reasons, these protests just didn't have the juice that you had in 2020. In 2020, like in 2020 you had lots and lots of people who were out there and police were overwhelmed and so on and so forth. And this time, you still had some areas where there were problems and there were troublemakers or whatever, Antifa, however you want to define that. But it just was not it didn't seem like it was not on the same scale, even aside from the police response or government response to 2020. So that's good. Maybe that's an indicate. Partly, that's probably indication of the so-called vibe shift or whatever. The mojo isn't behind that sort of thing, and then there's other reasons I think too, having to do with like the issue set or whatever. So, people, it's a big country. People have all sorts of different views about immigration. Uh, Personally, I'm not a huge hardcore immigration restrictionist guy. I do think one thing that is a pet peeve of mine is if someone is here illegally, whatever the circumstances, I don't feel a lot of chagrin if they get like deported or taken up in one of these ICE raids or whatever. Some people were frustrated. It's like, well, this person is not a criminal. You know, he's not a drug dealer or a gangbanger or whatever. He's just here illegally. Okay, but you're here illegally. You're kind of assuming the like that's part of the deal. You know, like you're breaking the law to be here, even if you're not doing anything else wrong.
There's still a chance. There's
Yeah,
still a chance.
a
What
chance.
you're trying to say is there's still a
Hey,
chance.
yeah, and if you're going to pick up your kids from school, I mean, this is the life that that you've chosen for yourself. You know, I don't. I'm sorry if that sounds heartless, but that is kind of my basic perspective on it. Aside from what the general policy should be on immigration or whatever. Um, so
I think the polls are actually showing, I think the Biden administration, the first 2 years, and like this is actually Biden's staff. I pretty sure he actually didn't support this, but he was too ineffectual to do anything. Their de facto open borders has turned off Americans for probably at least a decade.
right.
On a 1 billion Americans vision. I do have to say, yeah, I was much more open to restriction. Not open to. I was I definitely like be pretty like pretty restrictionist. Friends with Mark Krikorian, friends with Steve Saylor, all these people. I'm still friends with them actually. I don't have politics doesn't affect friendship for me, but it was a different time 25 years ago with our fertility, also with American hyperpower. Okay,
Mhm.
so one thing that I mentioned on Twitter is there are people who think that IQ matters. Who will talk about
You mean
who talk about like lower black IQ and its correlation with social dysfunction and all this stuff,
yeah,
and then all of a sudden IQ doesn't matter, in terms of like, well, we don't need that many high IQ people to make Silicon Valley work, and we have enough high IQ people here, and all of us. So, and I'm like, what's going on here? And I think part of it is, and I talked about this in a podcast with Steve Chu, professor at Michigan State. So there are right now 30 million. Is it 30 million? Yeah, I think 30 million people with IQs above 130 in China.
right,
Okay,
right.
it's about like 10 times. Actually, it's more than it's about 10 times. Yeah, it's about 10 times. Maybe a little bit more than in the US.
Yeah,
If you think IQ matters, okay, this is something to worry about. You know,
right,
if you don't think it matters, you don't have to worry about it. Now, some people will say, well, I mean, we have better institutions. We have, and some people will be like, well, do you really think just like lay it all out there. Do you really think that one white American with an IQ of 130 is 10 times more productive than a Chinese with an IQ of 130? And so I think that there's some mathematical truths there. If you accept some of the premises where it's like, we do need high IQ immigration. We just do. I mean, if you want America to compete, okay? And so I think that just needs to be something that's, and Trump totally actually believes this. Clearly. He said it over and over again.
right,
This isn't like one of his core views, like tariffs. He's not going to like die on it, but he said it over and over again in kind of like unguarded situations. This is what he says, which means that that's what his like real view is. And like, Elon Musk believes in this. On the other hand, Bannon does not, or I don't think he might not actually care. He might not care if we our second fiddle to China. I think there is a view, and we have friends like this. I would say um, that they just want America to be closed off, and in that way, we will magically go back to whatever year they want it to go back to.
right. When they were
I
not,
just don't think that this is happening.
yeah, yeah,
Even if you close the borders, I just don't think it's happening.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And one of the, traditionally one of the secrets of American success, or at least our conception of the secrets of our success, is that, oh, wait, as you say, there's 130 million Chinese people with the IQ.
30, 30.
There's 30 million. Excuse me. Yeah. Okay. So there's 30 million. Yeah. As it was coming out, I was like, wait, is that right? No. Yeah. Okay. So there's 30 million Chinese people with IQ of 130 or above. And one of the, you know, America's, secret to success or domination was that, if you're Chinese and you move to France, you can never really be French, right? Or if you move to, uh, you know, Japan,
Germany
never be
or Japan.
Japanese, right? But if you move to America, you can be American. So we have the ability to take in that talent from all over the world in a way that other countries did not. And I'm not sure that we really believe that about ourselves anymore, at least not to the same degree. I think one of like is I some of these MAGA people, I think if you were to make this argument to them that's like, hey, we need to bring high IQ Chinese people here so we can compete in the world stage, they would say, I mean, they wouldn't, maybe they would put it in this terms, maybe they wouldn't, but I think the underlying worry would be, well, if you bring in a high IQ Chinese person to the United States, they're still going to be loyal to China or
Yeah, and
see,
there is,
see things from,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
there is
It's
a problem with
not
Chinese espionage. There is a
right.
problem with
Yeah,
Chinese
that's not.
espionage.
It's not 100% false view. Yeah, yeah. Or even if
Yeah.
they're not, formally affiliated with the Chinese government or the Indian government or wherever it is, they don't think like an American. They don't, on an emotional level, uh, uh, they don't respond to America in the same way. Greg Cochran, this is as he can be. He has a way of putting things, and he said that he wanted America's like his view of our elites is that they should view the country like their left nut, right? You know, so it's like something that you're very, very protective of, and you want to.
Mhm.
And I think he was saying, and some of these other MAG people would be like, is it really plausible to expect that from if bring in really, really smart, talented people from across the world? Are they going to have that same connection? Uh, we already have a problem, I think, of like an elite that under identifies with the country and the people. Like a lot. I think some of our problems are that
Yeah, yeah.
you have
Well,
elites that they're out for themselves, or they view the general populace as
the vast
something,
unwashed.
yeah, yeah, something to be exploited or gotten around or whatever. So you know that so if we start thinking in those terms, right, then that's a problem. Like, okay, there's 30 million high IQ Chinese. Bringing them over here isn't going to solve that problem. That I think I think that would be the perspective of the like.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the whole idea is, that you bring the people over. It doesn't necessarily like automatically change their mindset, but the reality is, we did have a. I mean, I guess like the idea is like, is American liberal democracy and the American dream, is that a potentially universal aspiration? And
Right.
I mean, they're coming here. They still want to come here,
Yes. Right. Yeah.
and I do think that I do think it's still true. I mean, I was frankly a little doubtful in the teens, partly because China was accelerating so fast.
Yeah.
And also, I felt like our cultural, I mean, ironically or not, I think you could be more pessimistic because like, a lot of the woke stuff, some immigrants did assimilate to it, but they always, immigrants generally have found it weird. Like, it's weird. Like,
Right.
a lot of that stuff is really strange.
Yes.
It's very particular to a certain American strain of like professional managerial class liberalism and 1960s liberalism that just like is not actually generally universal and hard to relate to.
Yeah.
Actually, often it's well known that the immigrants in, say, tech companies were the least woke.
Right.
They were not influenced by it, and they just either tried to ignore it or resisted it. I think it's actually arguably, I would argue, it's easier to assimilate um, the immigrants to the more normie American, have a big McMansion, you know, and a swimming pool, like the economic vision, but also the vision of personal freedom,
Yeah.
just like living your life the way it is, the way you want to live it. And I think that that's actually easier now, uh, than it was 10 years ago when our cultural current was going in a like the trans stuff, for example, is like that's kind of like a flag,
Yeah.
of that, right? This is really strange stuff. And so I don't think that I think I'm less pessimistic about that than a lot of people, mostly because I think we are probably the last best hope for a global nation state in a way. We're not like world government, but kind of like, this is the place where people want to go to become a big deal, for excellence
Yeah.
and to be great. And the reality is, Jack Ma, he is Xi's bitch, you know?
Right.
um,
Wanna
so I mean, like some of the billionaires, some of the immigrant billionaires, like they're not going to be loyal to China or whatever country they're from.
Yeah.
Like only in America can a billionaire rise to the level of a peer of a head of state,
Right.
which is like I think that's we can like cut this as the paywall part. Like we can talk about our next topic, right?
Yes.
Because we did not talk about the the breakup and like now it's kind of like a détente, I guess, between Elon and Trump. You want to like recap what went down? Hope you enjoyed the podcast so far. To listen to the rest of it, please go to conversation.substack.com.
Two minds met on a summer's eve, each with truths they long believed. Words flowed like a winding stream as hours passed in deep debate. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. In listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. It's not about who's wrong or right, but understanding others' light. In civil discourse we can find ties that gently bind. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. As dawn broke soft on dewy grass, they smiled and shook hands at last. Two souls enriched by reason talk, united in respect. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. This folk song captures the essence of a long, thoughtful discussion between two public intellectuals. It emphasizes the power of patient listening, mutual respect, and the discovery of common ground. The gentle tone reflects the calm and understanding they reach after their debate. Would you like me to expand on any aspects of the lyrics or discuss the themes further?